also think it's a trap for Labour, let's be blunt about it. I think this is an action of a government that thinks it might be losing and wants to be in a really strong position from the opposition benches, perhaps this time next year. But what do I mean by that? Well, if the government cuts national insurance now and local income tax or income tax come next May, and then the public finances are as dire as we expect them to be, the emphasis will then be on Labour to raise them again, and then the Conservatives can turn around and say, there you go again, Labour doing what it always does, raising your taxes.
I feel, William, we've probably spoken about this. I'm sure you spoke about it when you were leading the Tory party. I'm sure Kezia did as well. The idea of welfare being fair to the right people, but not encouraging what some might say malingering, although Laura Trott wouldn't use that word herself. Is there something that can practically be done here? Are there people who want to work, who need help, and people who can work, who need encouragement? And can that ever actually be achieved by policy?
Well, you're right. This discussion has been going on for decades. It's become more urgent because there are a lot of people now who don't work because they're sick and claim benefit because they are sick for one reason or another. That's been much higher after COVID. So it's become an urgent thing to, if the government's going to balance its books in any way, to address that. It's always a difficult balance because you don't want to be harsh on people who are really sick. That's very important. But at the same time, work is good for most people. To put it bluntly, that is the best thing for most people is to have some work. And now we have much more flexible working available with new technology. So I think this will be an important part of tomorrow's autumn statement. And it's really important to make sure that that people are back at work. If for many people suffering from depression, for instance, the best thing is to be able to mix with other people at work.
But you can't do that if you're working from home. I mean, if you're working from home, you're not going to be mixing with people from work, which is one issue in this, I suppose. William, also, how honest can we be about this? This has got much worse since COVID. So either the nation is a lot sicker since COVID, or the nation pathologizes illness much more since COVID. It might be both of them, but it must be one of those two things.
Well, no, it can be another thing, of course. I mean, those things can have contributed to it, but this is also affected by benefit changes. And I think since universal credit came in, which has been a very good thing overall, because it gets rid of most cases where people are better off not working than working. It nevertheless has been associated with a big rise in sickness claims.
So it's softer when it comes to sickness, you think?
It's basically been easier to make those claims than in the past. So I think that the generosity or rules of the benefit system do have an effect on the number of people who end up off work sick.
Waiting list in the NHS will probably be another factor in this. Kezia, where would you put this down to? Do you think there is something in that there are more illnesses? I'm asking the question, I suppose, do people kind of rely on illness, the trappings of illness, the discussions about illness more now than they did, say, before 2019?
I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not aware of that in my own peer group or in my own world of work. What I would say, though, listening to Laura Trott speak this morning, and you've been focusing so much on journalese, that phrase, we believe in work. Well, find me somebody who doesn't believe in the principles of work, right, across the political spectrum. The problem with the descriptions that the Conservative use is it sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who's concerned about their benefits being taken away, because the Conservative approach to welfare is punitive, it is sanction driven, it is about saying that there are lazy people in this country who are the reason the economy is lagging, rather than focus on the things I'd much rather our government was doing, like cracking down on tax evasion and making sure the rich pay the taxes that are due. So we're back into one of these traditional tribal battles, left and right. And today's version of it is to focus on benefit claimants. Because
so a cynic would say about the left's position on that, Kezia, is that there's always money that can be found by being better at getting tax. But if that were the case, that money would have been found decades and decades ago, and it's never there. That's always the option, that we're going to do better at getting more tax out of people that's owed, which I'm sure is right, but never seems to actually happen.
Well, that's maybe a fair criticism, Stig, but I also think it speaks to your values and your priorities. What would you rather do first? Chase down benefit claimants or chase down tax evaders? I know what side of that I'm on.
William, just on this final point, then you're back to being the nasty party, potentially.
Well, I don't think so. When you look at how benefits have gone up, and as far as we understand it in the autumn statement tomorrow, they will be indexed again in line with inflation. Here, Kezia says it's what do you do first, but actually here it's what we do about 30th or 40th, because governments have been at this for a long time. It's not what you do first. We're way down the track here of how you try and get people into work, but also try and tackle tax evasion and things like that, that Kezia rightly mentioned. And governments have put a huge effort into that. In fact, much more of the tax revenue is now paid by the top rate taxpayers than used to be the case. So this is not what we're doing first. This is like a corrective along the way to try to get the system right between work and benefits. And I'm sure that discussion will go on for years to come.
Let's talk about tax cuts now. They weren't coming. They may be coming. Is it sensible, William, for the government to be looking at tax cuts? Obviously, it's an ideological thing. We know there's a very high tax burden, highest tax burden in 70 years in the UK. But someone makes the point on text. Government borrowing has increased again today. It is £14.9 billion, I think I wrote down, higher than last year. Please, can William Hague explain why tax cuts are even being discussed with such extreme rising debt levels?
Well, anything the Chancellor presents tomorrow, we don't know what he's going to say, of course, but would have to be consistent with that borrowing coming down over the next few years. So he'll only be doing this if he can confidently state that that is going on. All the economic projections, including by the Office of Budget Responsibility, that there is that headroom, that future borrowing comes down, and there would be room to reduce some taxes. Is it right to do that? Well, again, it's really the point I was making earlier. This is not where we're starting from. Recent years have seen huge rises in government spending and in taxation. Taxation overall is high since the 1940s. So it is right, when you've got some space to help people, particularly small businesses, particularly some people on middle incomes pay very high marginal tax rates. They lose more than half the extra income they earn. I don't know whether that will be part of what the Chancellor does tomorrow. But there is a strong case for reducing taxation when you can on people like that.
Kezia, are you on board for tax cuts, especially as we're now seem to be talking about national insurance rather than inheritance tax?
No, and let's be clear, if we weren't faced with an election next year, this wouldn't be happening right now. I just don't think even a Conservative government would be considering tax cuts out with an election cycle, and therefore potentially jeopardising the limited economic progress the government's made up until this point. It is a sweetie being dangled before us in any election contest. I also think it's a trap for Labour, let's be blunt about it. I think this is an action of a government that thinks it might be losing and wants to be in a really strong position from the opposition benches, perhaps this time next year. But what do I mean by that? Well, if the government cuts national insurance now and local income tax or income tax come next May, and then the public finances are as dire as we expect them to be, the emphasis will then be on Labour to raise them again, and then the Conservatives can turn around and say, there you go again, Labour doing what it always does, raising your taxes. So it's a clever wheeze. I'm just not convinced it would be happening if we weren't facing a general election.
Okay, interesting. I just want to ask you one other thing. Just a while ago, we were talking to the Labour MSP, Katie Clark. Anna Sarwar said he's going to vote for this motion on a ceasefire. We know when the same thing happened at Westminster, obviously the MPs who voted for a ceasefire were sacked or had to resign. We've been asking, obviously, this morning, is it a bit odd that the party takes a different line in Scotland? We understand that this is a process. We're talking about two different governments, and I suppose the question really was, we're talking about a principle here, but you have some skin in the game here, don't you?
Yeah, well, I was the Labour leader who secured the autonomy for the Scottish Labour Party back in 2016, I think it was, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. And it was basically a reaction to grown-up politics and the fact that we've had devolution now for nearly 25 years. And of course, political parties in different parts of the United Kingdom should be able to develop policy that best suits their local circumstances. Now, when I was talking about it, it was because we wanted to pursue a different policy on Trident from the rest of the UK party at the time. But again, it became helpful on questions of devolution itself. What powers the Scottish Parliament should have is something that the Scottish Labour Party should be able to talk about and not have to rely on Keir Starmer, again, for immigration. And now for Gaza, I think this is grown up and proper that the Scottish Labour Party can say what its priorities are. And it's one way, actually, that it will be able to defeat the SNP in the long run.
Now, Dom in Plymouth has emailed. The historian John Barry once wrote, "When you mix politics and science, you get politics." The COVID inquiry demonstrates that, if nothing else. Yesterday, the former chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, gave evidence. He said that scientists weren't consulted about Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme. William Hague, you're a big Rishi Sunak fan. In retrospect, did he just get that wrong?
Well, he'll be able to answer questions himself on the. There are lots of things, by the way, that governments all over the world got wrong at different times, because you had someone earlier on the program saying, remember, we didn't know everything we know now about COVID as it was going along. But I think on the Eat Out to Help Out thing, well, this is the same Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who was had the very generous furlough scheme that kept people paid their wages while they weren't able to go to work. A big drain on the economy. Obviously, he wanted to get some economic activity going as well. Small businesses, restaurants crying out for business. So this was the attempt to redress some of that. So I think one can justify it at the time. I mean, it will be up to the inquiry to judge which measures were right in retrospect and which weren't.
But there seems to be a direct link between Eat Out and Help Out and spreading the virus. And I think you can furlough and put as much money as you want into furlough, but if you're contributing to people potentially dying in a second or third wave, that's a pretty big mistake to make.
Well, again, they'll have to judge it at the inquiry. We were not telling people I wasn't in the government. The government was not telling people at that time to do nothing whatsoever, to have no mixing, to have no, there was meant to be, after the first wave of COVID, some gentle return to economic activity. Then, of course, another wave of COVID came along, which we all remember. But at the time of this particular scheme, not known. So again, you have to judge it by what was known at the time, and politicians have to do their best between competing priorities in these situations. But the idea that he was deliberately saying let people die, well, that is just that's somebody's view. That's apparently a Dominic Cummings view, but that expressed while he was shortly before he was testing his eyesight somewhere. So that's not necessarily a reliable judgment of this.
Kezia, how do you see this revelation that scientists were not consulted about Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme?
Well, I'm kind of with William on this, actually. I think Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, was doing what he was charged to do, which was to try and protect the economy as much as possible from a global health pandemic ravaging through it. So, the two things that he's most closely associated with during the pandemic, Eat Out to Help Out and furlough, are examples of policies designed to support the economy. But what I'm baffled by is that they were not seen through the prism of the pandemic. So Rishi Sunak could come up with the idea of Eat Out and Help Out, and it could be announced and delivered without the scientists being able to say what the impact of it on the pandemic would be. And if that information was then presented to the Prime Minister, he was the one that overruled it. It wasn't Rishi Sunak that did it single-handedly on his own at that time. I just think this speaks to a much wider feeling about the systems of government that allowed, one part of the government over here to be so focused on trying to keep people alive, and then another part of government actively creating policies which were driving people to get infected. I think that's the thing we should be concerned about, rather than the kind of hearsay about what Rishi Sunak did or didn't say and what the scientists were or were not consulted upon. Ultimately, it was Boris Johnson that took the decisions, and he carries the can.
Just quickly before we move on from this, though, Boris Johnson might not have understood what was explained to him. He was bamboozled, according to Patrick Vallance. He didn't understand exponential curves. Do you think there's an argument here that there's not sufficient scientific knowledge? Rishi Sunak would argue there isn't. That's why he wants people to do maths until 18, disastrously in my view. But there you go. Is there not sufficient scientific understanding in government, in your view, Kezia?
Well, of course there's not, but our leaders are generalists more often than not. So they cannot be expected to have, exemplary knowledge on every single policy area, on every single type of research or information or understanding that they're presented with. So then it becomes about the relationship they have with their advisors, the relationship they have with senior civil servants and the experts that are around them. And I think the problem with Boris Johnson was not that he couldn't read a graph, it's that he couldn't hold a line or a position for more than 6 hours at a time during the pandemic. And that's why we're seeing so much evidence coming through the inquiry about just the complete array of mess and just everything changing every few hours, and the Prime Minister really not knowing what he wanted to do or what his direction of travel was. I think that's the concern, not his grasp of statistics.
William, did you ever say in government, I don't understand this, I didn't do science, I didn't do, well, you probably did economics, but I didn't do science, this is not my background, I don't understand this, come and explain it to me?
Well, Kezia is quite right. You're going to be lucky to have somebody with exactly the right discipline at exactly the right time elected to political office, but then you do have to really make the effort to understand. You have to focus on something very complicated and spend hours learning about it and quizzing everybody about it around you until you're satisfied you do have enough understanding to make a decision. And well, that is, the depressing thing. And Kezia is quite right about this, about what's being revealed at the inquiry at the moment, is that in the Boris Johnson run Downing Street, that didn't seem to happen at all. That wasn't the actual personality.
There's no humility. I guess the question is, did you feel that you had humility? You'd be able to say, I don't understand. Because being able to say you don't understand something is actually quite a bold act when you want to be a leader.
As a minister, you often have to say that. You have to sit the officials down, scientists or whoever they may be, military people, whatever, and say, explain this to me. Explain all this terminology that you are using. And as I say, you sometimes have to spend hours. You sometimes have to read through lots of, hundreds of pages of stuff until you've really understood it. But that is normally a part of being a minister. But unfortunately, there have been a few exceptions to that in recent years.
Heather says, perhaps you should consider Professor Feynman's quote when discussing politicians' understanding of science. If you can't explain something in simple terms, then you don't understand it, which is a good rule of thumb, I think. Let's talk about something else that came out yesterday in the COVID inquiry. Patrick Vallance's diary and the very detailed notes they reveal about what was going on at the time. William, I understand you kept a diary. Why did you do that?
Actually, I've only kept a diary I managed to keep a diary for 4 years of the 26 years I was in the House of Commons. And why did I do that? Well, it's a good sort of mental discipline and a bit of history. And personally, I think for most of us, these things are best, if they're ever published or seen by anybody else, they're for far in the future. The best diaries are actually after people have died. Because then there is, there's no agenda to it. It's just the blunt truth. So I think I haven't, I didn't manage to keep a diary most of the time. And in those 4 years, they're not for publication.
So what period, tell us what period was this in your political life?
Oh, this was in the 1990s when I was an up and coming, this is my rise through the ranks of the ministers and getting into the cabinet and that sort of period. But then I became too successful. Then I became so successful, I was suddenly leader of the Conservative Party, never had time to write a diary at all, which is a pity. But in my more formative years as a politician, I did manage to keep a diary.
And you'll never do anything with it? Is it rude about people? Have you read it again recently?
It's not particularly rude. No, it's not. It's not designed with that in mind. And I haven't read it recently. It's put away in a secret place. And it will be I wrote a biography of William Wilberforce, and without his diary, which was meticulous, actually in his case, about how he'd spent every quarter of an hour through the day, every day. Without that diary, I would have had far less about the campaign to abolish the slave trade and how William Wilberforce was thinking. So I think these are important additions to history. They're not, in my view, something that illuminates something as an inquiry particularly well, or are to be published with an agenda in mind.
Kezia, do you buy that these things are new? Patrick Vallance said, I didn't mean this to be published, but I don't buy any diary writing as neutral. What about you?
Yeah, I agree with that, especially when you write colourful commentary about what you think about those people or decisions that they've taken. I mean, I've got a beautiful collection of small black moleskin books of the time I was a politician, but they're the dullest thing you'll ever look at in your life, because it's literally just got the date, who I met and what I agreed to do. There's none of that colour whatsoever. So I think anybody who's setting out to write that little bit extra is doing so with a purpose.
And also maybe they just got too much free time.